Hi everyone, it's Ann Tilley. I'm back again for another sewing video. It's been a minute since I've made a fun sewing video here on this channel. I have been busy working on building my new sewing pattern business. We just had a really exciting photo shoot last week for the next 3 patterns that are set to roll out at some point this year. So that's really exciting. I spent a lot of time in here making all of the samples for that shoot, which sort of felt like my own personal boot camp. And I didn't really have a whole lot of time, so it was a little bit stressful. And so today I've cleaned up my table, and my hope is to work on a more fun, relaxing sewing project. Of course, it's still going to be sewing because you guessed it, I'm obsessed with garment making. So today, my plan is I have been wanting to work on a pattern by another designer named Roberts Wood, based out of the UK. It is her Flowerpatch top. And she's a really interesting designer because she comes from sort of a more high fashion background from what I can tell through fractured images on Instagram. And she designs patterns that are kind of specifically meant to use up little off-cut bits of fabric, which I think is totally creative and awesome. I love the fact that her designs are more design forward for those of us that want to challenge ourselves or just be more creative in our garment sewing. I do have some trepidations about this pattern because it's got raw edges on it. So I'm kind of like, is this going to be a garment that I can wash and wear for years and years? I don't know. So I'm just gonna try it out and see how it goes. You know, she's interesting because she uses very specific fabrics and her designs are very feminine in a way that I don't necessarily relate to with my personal style. So I'm gonna try to figure out how I can adapt her aesthetic to my aesthetic. You know, it'll be an experiment. So let's talk about what fabrics I've chosen. In the instructions, she merely suggests light to mid-weight woven fabrics with a fairly dense weave. Also, somewhere where I can't quite remember, I feel like I saw that for her sample, she had used a silk organza and some linen. I do have some silk organza. This was something that I bought for my wedding dress and have never used since then. Well, actually, I finally used it for the first time last week during that photo shoot. I needed a sheer interfacing to use on this shirt, and it dawned on me that I could use silk. And so I was very pleased to get a chance to try this technique. I don't know how I knew to do it, but it worked out really well. But I don't want my shirt to be white. And so as a way for me to try to like de-femme it a little bit and make it feel more like me, I want to dye it a bright, beautiful red. Let's do it. If this turns out pink, I'm going to be pissed. Oh yeah, see, this is what I want. Pretty. Okay though, so I'm obsessed. Pay no attention to my drawers, but at least they're handmade. In her design, she uses 3 different types of fabric. I've got the organza now, so I need to find a couple other options to mix in. I landed on a cotton voile and an orangey red linen that was left over from my senior fashion collection, which I really enjoyed using something with sentimental value. It wasn't until I laid out the pattern that I really got a grip of how she designed this shirt and how it was going to come together. Each piece of this shirt is unique and requires its own pattern piece. That's probably close to 80 pattern pieces. I ended up omitting the bottom row to make the shirt shorter, so that saved me some time. But having to cut out each one of these pieces and having it be a combination of curves and points was extremely fiddly. Woo! Tedious. I did apply a fray check to all the edges of the linen because I just didn't trust that fabric to not fray like crazy, but I left all the other pieces raw. Now it's just the arduous task of getting all these pieces cut out and keeping them with their patterns so I wouldn't get confused about where this piece goes and in what orientation, because believe you me, the silk organza is a very cool, fun fabric to work with, but it wiggles like crazy and it can be hard to keep heads or tails of it. I'm honestly like slightly traumatized even watching this footage of me cutting all these pieces out because it was such a pain in my ass. I just got finished cutting out all of the pieces, which is great because the sun's starting to go down. It's starting to get cold in my studio. I really utilized the rotary cutter and my hand is sore as a result. But I'm in a good place to get started tomorrow and I can't wait to see how this sews up. To begin, I stacked each column of pieces in the order that they would be sewn to be pre-pressed along each stitch line. The pressing is going much more smoothly than I anticipated. When I went through the instructions last night, I was a little bit like worried that this was going to be as tedious as cutting, but it's actually been more enjoyable than I thought it was going to be. The problem I'm having though is she wants you to press it with the paper template, but on half of my paper templates, I've got a little bit of tape. So of course I'm not going to press the tape. So I can either press part of it and then I have to take it out and press it, or I just have to mark it. And I'm not marking the whole line, I'm just kind of marking corner to corner. On some of the pieces, like the pieces with the full petals, it's really obvious to see where the pressing happens. So that makes it a little bit easier, but you run the risk every time you take this off of the template that you're gonna like get it twisted or flipped. So you have to be careful of that. But other than that, I think it's only gonna take me about an hour to do all of the pressing today. Oh, also, this job is going so much smoother because of my nice DIY pressing template. This is simply just some aluminum sheeting that I bought in a roll from the roofing section at Home Depot and had it cut down on a metal shear at my local makerspace. After pressing, you're instructed to stitch each column together along those folded lines. I found it hard to sew on the fold, so I ended up going back and unpressing each side before I sewed it. And it does feel like maybe it was a waste of time, but you did still have the memory of that original fold. So it was still useful to pre-press. Once the columns were sewn, I started sewing the columns to each other, again pressing open what I needed to sew. Cool. So it's been a couple days. I've allowed myself a little bit of leisure time on this project, which has been really great because a lot of times I think I just work through a project so quickly that I almost in a way take the fun out of it because I'm just trying to like push all day sewing. So I did the back, I put it to the side, and then I just finished the front. And I have to admit that the patchworking process has been more fun than I thought. I definitely got into a flow, and then when I started to run out of pieces, I was like kind of sad that it was over. Because I took that time between the first and second one, I made some changes. Like I had chosen this sort of calico printed fabric as a piece in here, and I didn't really think about the fact that you look at both sides of the fabric with this design, and I didn't really like the look of the back side of that fabric, so I did seam rip that and take it out. And then when I got to the front, I just went ahead and took out the piece that I had put in there and just cut a new piece. That was not motivating to try to have to go back and cut more pieces. Cutting the pieces is probably the most tedious part of this project, but everything else has been pretty fun. I also had more silk charmeuse in the front, and then after I had used it on the back, you know, I already know that fabric's gonna be tricky to sew, but it was tricky to sew and then it didn't look good. And so I was like, okay, let me take a little moment to like also remove those pieces that I had originally planned for the front and replace it with this cotton voile that I feel like looks a lot nicer. Now I just need to take a look at the instructions and get the shoulder and side seams put together, and then I'll move on to the binding. I have not cut out any binding, and I've chosen not to think about it till this very moment. So here we go. Sewing the front to the back was pretty straightforward. The side seams were actually totally normal and were the only place that didn't have petals to press open. Definitely pressing was a big part of this design, and I feel like I'm even more impressed with Roberts Wood's samples because it's not as easy as it might seem. In the true spirit of this design, I used the last of my cotton voile scraps to piece together the bias tape for hemming all the edges. I used 1.25 inch wide bias cut strips and folded it with a Clover brand folder. With the right side of the bias tape touching the right side of the garment, I start sewing in the pre-folded groove of the tape. I like to be lazy and not pre-measure the tape to the opening. Instead, I leave a couple inches of tape unstitched at the beginning and stop a couple inches short of where I started. I will also make sure that a seam on the main body of the garment is centered in between my 2-inch gap. Then I lay each side of the tape down and mark that seam on the tape. Now I know where to attach the beginning and end of the tape to each other. I line up my tape ends at a right angle, just like I did when piecing the tape, and sew, making sure I hit my seam mark. Then I test that it lines up before clipping the excess tape away, and I finish sewing the tape to the hem. Once the initial seam is completely sewn, I'll turn the bias tape entirely inside of the hem opening and stitch along the other pre-folded edge. I like to do this from the inside so I can get close to the edge of that fold. The stitch never looks quite as nice on the bobbin side, but it's worth it to me to sew it this way so that I know I will catch all of the tape in my stitch. I'm also making sure that I pull the tape in enough so that it's rolling the right side of the garment towards the inside of the garment. I thought that this wider type of bias tape would seem bulky, especially around the neck, but I was happy with the results, and wow, it gives so much sturdiness to this shirt now.
My husband took me out that night in my new shirt to an intimate musical show featuring a lovely quartet from Alabama. I also wore it to the launch of my new sewing pattern, the Endless Summer Shirt. After that, I attempted my first wash. I could already see some fraying after wearing it and was curious to know how it would hold up. I clearly did a poor job of rinsing out the dye initially, but I knew I was going to be hand washing it separately anyways, so I didn't let myself be bothered. I definitely needed to repress every petal back open after the shirt dried. Perhaps I could have washed it more delicately than I did. I don't see any way that you could immerse this shirt in water and not need to repress it afterwards. And spot cleaning might not go very far after a while. Also, my friend gifted me this table that I'm trying out as a possible ironing surface. It's at a much better height than my old ironing board, and I love the extra storage underneath. After the wash, there's certainly more fraying than before, except the linen held up perfectly thanks to the fray check. And the press is not quite as nice as it was after it was initially completed. But what do you think? Would you make a garment like this? I personally found it refreshing to make something for art's sake, and it made me realize how deeply entrenched I am in thinking practically. I mean, am I really afraid of some frayed edges? After making this shirt, I was inspired to try my hand at using this patchwork technique, but even more in my style. I used the scraps of some t-shirts I'd cut into last year to make this wonky checkerboard tee, although I don't know how successful the look of the wonkiness is over my chest. It's amazing how easily you can make something from nothing when you use patchwork. I added this little boutonniere as a bonus onto the Roberts Wood top, but I found that I love wearing it on lots of other shirts as well. Perhaps that's the best part of the whole project? Thanks so much for following along. Please like and subscribe if you liked this video. My name is Ann Tilley, and as always, happy sewing. Bye.